It's my pleasure to welcome you, Nicole. As you see, she is not Roger Bellis, or you could assume at least. And you will introduce yourself. We've known each other for at least 5 or 10 years, probably, through the Executive Corporate Learning Forum, being learning and development leaders in our different organizations. And Nicole has worked closely with Deborah Rowland in the past 3 years at RWE in the corporate transformation, and also on a new study about the influence of a leader's inner condition and the outside world he or she is creating. And that fits very much, I think, to how we ended Peter's presentation in the morning. And I think it's going to be also looking into a lot of practice there. So thank you, Nicole, and your space.
Thank you. Let me check first that my voice carries sufficiently to the back of the room. Otherwise, I'll use a microphone, but I'd rather not if it works this way.
It's okay here.
It's okay here. How's it in the back of the room? Okay. Yeah. Okay, then. Okay, so then we'll work with that. Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for having me, actually. It feels quite privileged to have this opportunity to engage what hopefully is going to be more a conversation rather than me spending 90 minutes on exploring all details of the research we did over the course of the last summer. I'll give you a brief structure overview of what I've had in mind, but happy to adjust also in line with your expectations for this morning. But maybe first of all, yes, who am I? My name, Michael kindly said, Nicole Brauckmann. I've been working with RWE for the last 15 years in the HR arena. I know some faces here in the auditorium, which is nice. We've met before. And over the past 3 years, I've been engaged with a group of individuals, actually not a brand name business school, in one of the major change initiatives we ran in RWE in order to face the challenges the energy industry as a whole is facing. I'm sure you've picked up on that in the news. It's hardly avoiding it. So what I want to do in the next 30 minutes, roughly, is give you an overview of what were the questions we started with, how come we asked the questions, then how did we go about the research, what were our key findings, and finally, what are our first ideas around how to put that into practice and how, in the case of RWE, have we actually trialed that. So this is by no means finished. The book is, as we speak, written about all of this, and you'll have the opportunity, if you like, to read more about it sometime later this year. So this is a bit of a sneak preview with all the flaws that could possibly be in here. So that's why I'm so excited about this opportunity to be here this morning and to also have your views on what we've come up with. After these 30 minutes, Michael said, I'd invite you to use the beautiful rooms in this building. I had hoped for driving down here this morning. We would have the opportunity to take a walk in the beautiful park, but I'm not sure weather allows, or maybe some of you are courageous and decide to go and venture about in the park later on. But in those breakout rooms, or breakout session for 30 minutes, maybe you could explore how any of that, what I'm about to present, makes sense to your experience, your observations, and how you've maybe already seen that in practice and how that would inform your own practice, so that once we come back, we can finish off with a more plenary conversation around how this could influence your work in the future and actually inform us in our work we will do in the future. Is my voice okay? Is speed of speech okay? Good, wonderful, just checking. So, this one. Where did we got started? As I said, I've been with RWE for 15 years roughly, and as one of the DAX corporations in Germany, you can imagine we had it all. We had state-of-the-art performance processes, we had state-of-the-art 360-degree feedback appraisals, we had potential appraisals, we had success management, all of that. And of course, we worked with the big brand names in leadership and executive development. Did it yield what we were hoping for? Yeah. Yes, we saw change in individuals, but as an organization, did we get the feeling that it brought us the decisive step forward? Not really that much. So when again a new CEO came in 2012, 2013, and asked us to come up with yet another leadership initiative to help his top executive team to move the organization through very, very challenging times. And we are not through that yet, or RWE is not through that yet. It was clear that we needed to do something different. And we trusted our gut instincts, actually. We said we are not going for IMD, for Harvard, for you name it. But we selected a hand-picked few individuals. One of them being Roger Bellis, actually, who was supposed to be here this morning, but who couldn't make it. And given that we've worked so closely together, both in this program as well as in the research, I stepped in for him.
Could you shortly say who is we? What company is it?
The company we did the program for was RWE, and the research team is a group of individual consultants, not one company, but actually a network of freelancers. And that's one of the key things I'll come to later, what was a different thing about the change initiative run at RWE, because we said intentionally no to the brand name people. We said we want those individuals we trust in and where we believe it can work with them. Because what we had in mind when we started out was this inner conviction, as I'm sure many of you would share, that for good leadership, a couple of things need to come together. Yes, it is leadership techniques, if you like, practice, what people can do, tools, tricks of the trade. But it also is about the mind of a leader, and it also is about the body, the physical stature of a leader. And finding someone who could combine all that in the way we did that in the past when we would run a tender. We tried that actually, and we realized soon we wouldn't get what we needed from them. So we went down the other path and selected hand-picked individuals, and I can say more about the criteria, how we select them before we split. In any case, what we came up with, this program, this seemed to work. And then we realized, well, mindfulness is all about in the media, it seems to become mainstream almost, lots of new things on leadership, which piqued our interest to see, yes, everyone thinks that it works, but does it work? Can we prove that? And that's where we got started with the research project we ran last summer. Actually, if you know the name of Deborah Rowland, she has done a similar research project already in 2006-2008, which led then to the work Sustaining Change. But at that time, the research only looked at what leaders do and how to distinguish what leaders did in successful change processes to leaders who led less successfully through change. So we went back to the original research and added to it a number of other additional news stories from leaders across the globe, across all industries, profit, non-profit organizations. We had face-to-face or telephone interviews with them as long as 90, 120 minutes. We had a questionnaire we filled in to see how the change process was ranked by themselves, and then given on what they had, the facts they had given us by other people, so that we could also relate a multi-source rating of the success of change and the complexity of the change to the research, and we coded all those interviews. And in coding all those interviews, we managed to extract, again, the behaviors we had seen in the earlier research as successful in change, as well as certain inner state capacities of a leader who seem to have a tremendous impact on how successful leaders lead through change. There was a lot of statistics done, and I'm not an expert on statistics, but a lot of social scientist work spent in coding and then doing the numbers, the number crunching, so that ultimately we could come up with a description of the inner capacities and the outer practice, what leaders do in change, the being and doing of change, which actually in our research gave more than 50% of the reason why some changes were much more successful than others. And we call that still moving because it has this duality of doing things but also just being. and the inner state. So we focused particularly on change processes led by people at the top level of the organization, so C-suite executives, -1, -2 at the most, but really people in significant roles leading significant change projects. And almost all industries, it's not typical for the energy industry, unfortunately, these days, but all industries are faced with an increase in complexity and uncertainty. So we looked out for what makes the difference in those cases. It's not about a simple, introduction of a new process or IT tool, but really where it gets difficult with the nasty business of complex change. We could prove, as I said, that both capacities, how a leader approaches things, how he is or she is, and how she acts, both significantly contributes to the success. And we could show, and that links perfectly to what we've seen in the earlier contribution, I think, from Peter Hawkins, that the key inner capacity for leaders to be successful is about their ability to act, to perceive, and to intervene systemically. So to hold the broader picture in mind with whatever they do. And then go through that in a bit more detail in a second. The primary leadership practice, so what we saw leaders do who were significantly successful in change, was that they were able to bring purposeful edge and tension to the organization. So to name what's not right yet, to keep pointing out where an organization could stretch its performance, to have the tough dialogues where it needed, and also to make the decisions, even if it's a difficult one, and to realize what works and what doesn't work, and to call it what it is, and no pussyfooting around it. And that, in particular, contributed to accelerating speed in change. Not surprisingly. I mean, many of the things, I must say, when you look at that from the outside, in hindsight, it almost feels like, well, yeah, but that's obvious, it's common sense. But we could actually prove it. So that in order to move change about, you need this capacity, which, by the way, is not that strong in many of the leaders we had across our research. So it seems to be something really unique. And then another finding was that particularly when a whole organization was involved, and it was really complex, a lot of insecurity involved, the ability of the very, very top leaders to remain calm and provide a non-anxious, trust-building environment seemed to be key for the success in change. As we sometimes say in other contexts, a leader's emotions are contagious. So we are all hardwired in our brains to look out for the leaders and how they appear, how they seem to be. So if the leader is anxious, frightened, and unsure, that will spread like wildfire through the organization. So particularly for the top leaders, it's important that they manage to do things that build trust and keep anxiety at an acceptable level. You don't want to take all of that away because then you probably won't get much movement. But you also want to balance it out with other stuff. Then again, a bit what Peter Hawkins has said earlier, particularly for the top leaders, it is important to acknowledge the whole in change. The capacity to see what's really going on, to look out for the 13th fairy. I love that picture. I may steal that in the future, I have to say. To look out who is really affected by this change and who do we need to involve to have the right conversations. And what may seem like resistance, but actually is helpful information for me to refine and review what we are doing, all of that. I'm not going to talk much about that, but another finding was that the overall change approach, how we see change, how we believe change works, defines much of the success of change. So the idea that change can be done top-down, directive, I know all the answers from a leader, probably will fail. the assumption that we need an emergent change because too much is going on, no one can have all the answers. That actually was another finding in the study. We saw, and finally, we could prove that low success in change often is driven by very egocentric leaders, leaders who are too full of themselves to take in what actually happens out there, who think they have all the answers, they need to control it all, what we would call non-mindful, not really noticing what's going on for themselves, in themselves, and for others. That certainly didn't contribute to the success, as well as this notion of change being driven very much top-down and directive, like it was in the past. So, whoops, that's not quite how it should look like. You know what? Can we blank that? Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'll do it on the flip chart actually, because the inner capacities we found and we distinguished as key factors in successful change are both almost an antecedent and also an enhancement for what you see on the outside of a leader. So that's why I'm going to start with the inner capacities. And again, looking at it from the hindsight may seem common sense, but actually really being present, staying present in the very here and now is one of the underlying capacities for leaders. So you'll get the slide in more beautiful display afterwards. I'm terribly sorry. A leader who is able to notice what's going on for him. Am I distracted by anything? Can I suspend that distraction for a moment to really notice what's going on here for my team? Where does my distraction come from? Do I bring something from a meeting before, or am I anxious about a meeting to happen? And how can I work with myself in order to suspend that, to be really present here? In the research, we had the beautiful story of a lady who relocated to Singapore to do a change project there in one of the call center hubs. And she had great ability to be present in the very moment, but she also knew that she needed to cultivate that. So, for example, she would take the lunch breaks out of the office environment and go out and find a park and a quiet spot to sit in, and to allow herself to be grieving for what she had left behind in Britain, where she came from, and to allow her homesickness to have that place so that when she was back at work, she could fully concentrate again on being here. That's what behind the staying present. Next level up would be what we came up with: curious and intentional responding. And a brief recap of that is allowing yourself to have choice. Not to be in the default mold all the time, but leaders who have the ability to see all the options for actions which are there and choose the most appropriate one, and not the ones they've always used or which feels the most natural to them. That's what behind this one. The second inner capacity we came up with, the third one, is tuning into the system. Making a conscious effort to notice what's going on. Some leaders told us they were walking the open plan floors, listening into conversations with people, and taking in, and actually then being able to express that, and making use of that in the next meeting to see what needed to be done. As a brief example of this one. And the most important, but also the most difficult capacity we only saw displayed by very few leaders was what I've already mentioned. Acknowledge the whole. So whatever happens with some value in it. Even distractions, even disturbance, even disruptions. I may be able to find some value in that. I loved the example earlier this morning when I listened into how do we see competitors. And to see competitors as a resource would be exactly the mindset which is behind this acknowledge the whole. There is something for me I can take out of this situation which may help me get forward. Now, I know that sometimes this sounds a bit like this over-optimistic, naive, do-gooder thing. Everything has sense, everything is there for a purpose, and it may be difficult at times to really see that. And it's not the intention to say everything is great, but to make sure that we integrate everything in what we do, because systemically, if we don't attend to it, it will stay, it will come back at us and be difficult, even in the future. So better to acknowledge it and to do something about it than to just ignore it and pretend it maybe even happened. So that's the 4 inner capacities. And we ask leaders if they applied any mindfulness practice, for example, or if they consciously choose things to help them train on that. And there were a number of different strategies, and maybe that is something for you later on in the breakout groups to explore. How have you seen leaders build these capacities, and how could we help actually leaders in our practice to be more aware of these capacities and develop them for themselves? Then the external practices. Attractor is a bit a misleading word, particularly for German audiences, because it sounds a bit like the charismatic leader who shows off and is glorified. That's not what's meant by that. But an attractor is a person who is able to clearly bring meaning and purpose to whatever is done in the organization. So to create a pull, a direction for the change. That's what we understand when we talk about a leader. And you'll see leaders, of course, talk about the vision or the aspirations of a company, but also just actually live that and give the people a feeling of purpose in whatever they do, on whatever level of the organization they are. And that brings people together. And it's not about the leader being the one who knows it, but it's about the purpose, and the purpose being clearly visible everywhere. Similarly, channeling energy comes from what we also call a container as an external practice. Container means a leader who is able to provide a safe space. I said earlier, too much anxiety paralyzes an organization, and I'm sure you've seen that in your practice. So a leader who is able to help his team feel safe in certain boundaries and to be explicit about the frame, whether that's regular meetings, whether that's saying, you can trust that whatever I know and whatever I learn, I will tell you as soon as I can share it. Or we don't have the new rules yet. So long as you act on the old rules, I'll back you up and people trust in it. All of that can be container. And I think I like the image of a container, the container ship. So it's not the container for recycling we often have in Germany, but the containers you use in order to move large bulk of stuff with the ship across the oceans. That is exactly the energy which is behind this external practice. Now I've talked about 2 energies, as I said, who bring direction and guidance and stability. Of course, no change would happen if that would be the only energy present. So the other 2 energies you'll need, and the other practices you'll see successful leaders apply, is, as I said earlier, edge intention. So the ability of a leader to name what is the case, whether that's good or bad. And to say, well, we agreed we do this, yet we've done that. Let's have a conversation. It's not meant to be clobbering or beating people down for what they have not done right, but it's really encouraging to aim for an organization's potential. to say, well, we are still here, but I think we could get there. I have one example in mind from the study where a person described he had conversations with a team who was responsible for putting in offers for tenders. And they always came in last or second to last. And he said, there was a point, I can't talk good about that anymore. I just have to say, well, let's see what is the fact. And whatever we do and whatever we believe we do right, fact is we come in second to last or last in every tender we join. So what do we do with that? And you usually realize as a leader when you have an edge and tangent conversation that the blood level goes up, heartbeat speeds up. But that's the really important spot. If we don't point it out, how should people know where to change to? And finally, a fourth practice we found people doing. Transforming space. Ensuring that the change we want to see happens in this very moment. I can have great plans for what I want to change next year or tomorrow, but the only thing that actually can change is now. So, for example, in an organization which was quite hierarchically driven, we always had project sponsors, but the sponsors weren't actually involved in any doings of the project. The sponsor was someone very remote. So in order to decrease the hierarchical distance, a CEO said, I want to be sponsor of this project. And actually, you bet I'm going to be involved. He was there at every project meeting. He overruled his whole diary, and you know what most diaries look like these days, to be present with the team when they needed it. And he really wanted to engage in the more operational conversations. So that would be an example of actually working on the change you want to see in the larger organization. Another example can be something as simple as the layout of a management conference. If you run management conferences, a bit like this one with many seats facing front, and less opportunity to break out and have conversations with each other, maybe even scripted to the very detail, where even Q&As are pre-aligned, and I would guess there still are some organizations around there where you find that. Do you expect that to be an organization where upward feedback can happen? Do you expect that to be an organization where open dialogue and emergent change can happen? Yes. So even those tiny details of how is the room laid out? Is the board standing on a podium? Are they on stage? Or are they in the middle of the people? Who has the right to speak? Who speaks? Who presents? Are there any presentations, or are there just open conversations? All these questions with intention, not just for the sake of changing it, but with intention, that's behind this notion of transforming space. And I think it's easy to see how those inner capacities help you apply those external practices in a more skillful way, and also maybe more effortlessly, because that was something we also wanted to achieve for our executives in RWE when we ran the program there. It wasn't about just making them better leaders, but with what these people had to do, we wanted them to be equipped as best as we could to do it with the least possible effort. It would still be tremendously an effort. But this ability to really listening into themselves and have a good knowledge of self-centeredness and take that into any situation, that was what we aimed for. So I'm trying to go back now to the slides, because what I tried to do with animation should be gone now. So, danke, Michael. What we saw in the concept we did, which I briefly introduced to you, and later on I hope we have an opportunity to engage a bit more in a conversation around that, and I'm happy to fill in more details if you like. But what we also saw, when change doesn't go well, as I said, I think in the beginning, leadership with low self-awareness, very egocentric and not at all ecocentric, not systemically aware, that's when things usually go wrong, actually explained quite a high degree of failure in change. This notion of non-mindfulness, not knowing what's really going on for me, what's really going on in this very moment for the others, explained another great proportion. Interestingly, we had this question on a questionnaire asking leaders, how successful was your change? And those leaders who said, oh yeah, it was great, where outside raters would say, yikes, often were the leaders where we would also see a lot of shaping and non-mindful behavior in practice, because there seems to be a correlation between non-self-awareness, misjudging my own accomplishments, and what we see here. As I said, there are change approaches who are more directive, more top-down, or more, oh well, I've prepared a pack for you, here, take it, you do it. You'll also see more of that in those change approaches and in those reasons. So that's a brief summary of what we did in research so far. Where we are now at, and that's what's now also I would love to hand over in your hands, is what can we do to use this knowledge, as not skillfully chiseled out as it is yet, but what it clearly indicates that. How can we use that in application? And how can we use that both for the self? How can we build 360-degree feedback processes who attend to these things, as well as how can we design team interventions who attend to these things, and how can we help organizations to see more systemically? The example of, I used to work in one of these organizations who has a lot of internal and external coaches in. Did we harvest the organizational systemic knowledge we could get from that? Not until very recently, where we have started to do that. Does it work yet? Yeah. So is our thinking. And to finish off, what I've spent the last 3 years of my life with in RWE was trying to get this OD intervention running, which was targeted at the top 300 executives, and closely aligned with two other change engines, which I think is one of the success factors, that we had strong interfaces and we tried to have the same mindset, the same philosophy, and the same content in whatever we do, that we decided not to go for one of the brand names, but were courageous enough to go for individually selected individuals, that we adjusted the program as we went. So RWE has made the decision to split last December, which was, and we did quite a significant redesign of the program because the content of it obviously wasn't relevant anymore. That we had lots of interfaces with the organization. So we had meetings at the tops with the board of the different divisions, and we constantly fed back not individual assessment, but what did we as faculty see in these programs? What were the voices we heard? What did we notice? What was communicated from the top? How was it landing with the people we saw? And then also putting the challenge in the room, saying, hey, you think you communicate enough about change? People tell us they know nothing. And then, as I said in the beginning, I think, this holistic approach, trying to have all levels or all aspects of a personality involved in the program, whether it's spirit, if you dare to say that, or mind, body, and the practice. And finally, the program wasn't taught. There was less lecture. There was a lot of co-creation. What do we need to talk about now so that this whole experience becomes relevant for us? So, what do you need to talk about to make this relevant to you? But of course, questions maybe first.
Nicole, could you just help me with some context?
Mm-hmm.
Because doing this research would have been an intervention in the organisation in the first place. So I'm not sure I understood what triggered the research.
Okay.
Who was the client for the research?
The research wasn't linked to RWE, so sorry if I've not been clear about that. Some of the RWE participants were part of the research set, the sample of executives we talked to, but the research was us consultants being intrigued by what we saw and wanting to have more than our gut feelings to rely on and saying this is important.
So RWE happened to be one of the
Yeah.
organisations
Yeah.
that did the research?
Yeah. And a lot of the people who did the research were faculty in the RWE program, so we already, of course, then tried to bring that in there. Yeah, sorry. Important point, thank you. Yeah.
Time scale? How long did the program?
The program is still running till mid this year, and it took us 3 years to get the top 360 people through. Maybe later on more about the details of the program. If there's any interest, or over coffee later on, I'll be around for a bit more. Love to. But I think some of you, or at least I know, are dying to get out and get active yourself. So let me have a look and brief check with Michael. Half an hour till 1:45?
What should happen?
Well, what I would be interested in is what of this was new, insightful, or reminded you of something you already knew as well, and you now found nice to see maybe from a different angle. And secondly, how would you make this relevant in your practice? We are looking now into prototyping. How can we do interventions with organizations, almost as much as Peter described it, who are more targeted at the systemic level? So what needs to happen to make interventions relevant on the backdrop of these insights of the research? And how would you see to bring that into your application if you like it? Clear enough? Yeah? Good. Then see you in a bit. Okay. Tuning into the energy in this room right now, I think you had lively and hopefully inspiring conversations in between, whatever they were about. But I also am conscious that I'm starting to get in the way of you and between you and your lunch, and that's a dangerous spot to be in. So let's start with the last bit of what I had in mind for us to do together. So really my curiosity now would be from any of the groups, if there are questions to me or to others, or if there are insights, ideas you came up with and you would like the others to share really. So
I guess this is a challenging observation, which is if you look at the world of competencies, they describe a leader or a manager or an individual who can never exist because they're bits of people, bits of great practice that get pushed together into a competency matrix. My question to you is, if I was a leader in RWE and you showed me all of these things, I'd be very frightened because I don't know that there are many people who can do all of this. And so the question that we were asking ourselves in our group was, given the reality that you can't create these perfect leaders, what are you going to do?
okay, first of all, let me rephrase or repeat the question so that we can be sure even people in the back have understood it. And the observation from this particular group is that this seems to be, like many other competency models, the ideal leader, and as an ideal, obviously something hard to aspire for, and probably all of us will fall short in striving to get there. Is that correct? And what to tell an RWE or any other leader if we would present that as the ideal. Now, the thing is that I don't see this as the ideal where you have to be. For me, this is like a compass. And we don't use it actually in RWE as a competency model.
No, I know.
So it's just something you can look at in order to inform clients or yourself as a leader about what you do. and try to cultivate some of that. But it certainly also will look different. What I find helpful to think of here is this is something you actually can cultivate, and people may end up on different levels there, but that's how life is, I guess. So I haven't put that in front of an RWE leader, actually, and said, this is how you want to be. But it gives you a layer to look at what you could do. So it helps you broadening the options you have as a leader. Maybe that's a way to put it. But maybe, yeah.
What Peter said, which is if we only look at things through the leadership development lens, does that constrain how we create an organisation where these things can happen? And so are there multiple approaches that you could take which would allow this behaviour to come out? So
I would just say it would be really useful to take that model and that slide and that output, and then to get a team to look at how do we do this together. We don't need to individually do it all, but where do we have the capacities, where do we grow them, and how might some of those capacities exist between us, and where else are they in the organisation, so that we see these as not, something a heroic leader has to do, but leadership has to do.
There was another.
Qualities that are needed for real co-creation to be open, and so maybe it doesn't really matter who
does it.
Who does it? And maybe not only one person does it all the time. So it changes. Qualities for teams, for organizations.
Yeah, and I do agree with what Peter said in the sense of maybe we can find ways to do whatever is needed in an organization which are not confined to one individual. And yet I would also caution the individual leader to say, oh, I'm good at a tractor and I'll leave edge and tension to everyone else. So this is not necessarily meant as something you have to be good at on all 4 levels. That's simply not realistic. But how I would like to use it and how I have used it is to say, well, this seems to be important. And maybe it helps. Sometimes, like with traveling, sometimes you need to know what you could potentially see in order to see it. So having this as a reference in your own mind, whether it's a coach or a leader, to refer to and see, well, is all of that covered, or do I need to do something about one of the aspects which, for whatever reason, has been underrepresented so far? That would be more like it. I would fully agree, asking people to aspire for that. Yeah. Succession Management Conference is shortly finished. Or any other thoughts? I mean, I'm aware I haven't been the only contributor to this conference, and I'm not sure if you had opportunity to bring up anything else that feels important after Peter's contribution earlier this morning. My stomach starts grumbling. I'm not sure if that's only my energy or if your energy also is targeted more towards lunch, maybe. So, Michael, I know you wanted to have a moment before we head for the break.
We would like to give you a moment, Nicole. Thank you very much.